It's 3 o'clock, so we're going to get started. My name is Laura Polari-Welbus. I'm the director of Encore Learning, and I'm delighted to be here today for Encore Learning Presents. We have author Barbara Noe Kennedy talking about Arlington's often unknown history. So it should be a great presentation. Lots of folks joining us, and happy to have you here. Today's event is being recorded and will be on our YouTube channel tomorrow, so you can look for that. This is a Zoom webinar. We use the Q&A for getting your questions, and there will be lots of time for questions after the presentation. So please put your questions in the Q&A. We do not use the chat. You can enable live transcript, the closed captions if you like, on your own device. At the end of the event, there will be a link to a survey that allows us to get feedback about the event. So please take a moment to fill out that survey. And send us an email if you're having any technical issues and we can help you out. I just want to highlight a couple of upcoming events. Well, many of you may have received your catalog in the mail. The Encore Learning Fall Semester Catalog has been reaching mailboxes around. And you can learn all about the fall semester at our fall course preview. That's our next big event. It's September 4th at 9:30 on Zoom. So join us then. And then we're delighted in September, we've got a hybrid event with a popular former instructor, Dan Sherman, talking about Wagner, a gentle introduction to Wagner. And that's on Monday, September 15th. That'll be hybrid with it being in person at George Mason at Ben Meter Hall, as well as on Zoom. We do have some other tours and a baseball game and lots of things coming up. Louise and I were just talking that we have 3 hybrid special events this fall, so pretty exciting. So I'm going to stop share and bring in Louise to give us a welcome and introduction to today's event. Thank you so much for coming.
Laura, thank you. I'm happy to be here again. Louise Kenny, I'm on the special events team here at Encore Learning. We do have exciting things coming up, and we have an exciting event today. We decided to go a little lighter in our presentation today. Our last presentation had to do with somewhat about politics, but certainly about the world situation. And our speaker was coming to us from Poland and talking about perceptions of Americans versus Europeans and that whole area. So today we're focusing on Arlington, our hometown for many of us, and certainly regionally a key hub of activity. So we have Barbara Noe Kennedy, who's going to be speaking with. Barbara is a travel writer and editor. She was a longtime editor of National Geographic Travel Publishing. She has an MA in journalism from the University of Missouri. She's a member of the Society of American Travel Writers and the National Press Club. She's won an award with a Lowell Thomas Travel Journalism Award, and she's been published in many, many publications, from Photos to Southern Living to San Francisco Magazine, articles about Europe, Paris, Belgium. She had an article I was interested in, 12 iconic foods that San Francisco put on the map. So I have to skim that since I know people in San Francisco. So we're very pleased to have Barbara. She's written a book, 100 Things to Do in Arlington Before You Die. And there are sites that you might not be aware of, but also for this particular presentation, she's going to be focusing on the history of Arlington and telling us things that we might not know about. I also wanted to mention to you that Barbara has a website, barbaranoekennedy.com. And on her website is information about upcoming travel writing workshops. She's involved with the group Women in Writing, and that's the website for them, womeninwriting.com. And her
on writing. Sorry.
Oh, on writing. I'm sorry. Right. Women on Writing. And her course will be promoted there, and then also on her own website, Barbara Noe Kennedy. So without further ado, here's our local expert on Arlington, both the sites and the history. Barbara?
Well, thank you, Louise, for that wonderful introduction, and welcome everyone to a beautiful afternoon discussing Arlington's amazing history. And thank you for being here. I know it's beautiful outside. So You know, it's tempting to be out there in that nice weather. But here we are, a stone's throw from the nation's capital, which gets all the spotlight for its history. But Arlington is the same age as Washington, D.C., with some sites even older. So it's high time that we give it its due. I've lived in Arlington since 1993, and I've witnessed it grow and shift and transform and change. And that evolution, this constant redefinition of who we are, is history in motion. And so I've been a witness to that. Obviously, Arlington's much older than that, but even in that amount of time, there has been tons of change, and that's history. So when Reedy Press asked me to write 100 things in Arlington to 100 things in Arlington to do before you die, my first thought was, I'm not sure about the title, but it's part of a series, so I didn't really have any say in that. But yes, after living here for so long, I can write that book. I can write that book at my dining room table. But as a longtime travel journalist, I knew better. So I put on my travel writing hat, the same that I use when I visit places around the world to explore with fresh eyes. And so I visited sites that I knew or thought I knew, where I learned so much more. And I discovered brand new sites as well. And what I found was more than just a vibrant community. I found layers of resilience and contradiction, stories both painful and inspiring, histories buried in backyards, etched into old stone, whispered through neighborhoods shaped by struggle and survival. And those discoveries gave new meaning to the chapters that I had outlined in this book. And the different chapters are food and drink and recreation, entertainment, culture, the arts. But the one that really pulled me in the most was the history section. Arlington's history isn't just rich, it is revealing. And the more I explored, the more I realized how deeply the past still shapes our sense of belonging. And so that's what I want to share with you today, a few of the stories and places that make up the often overlooked, always evolving history of Arlington. And the way I've set up this presentation is as a virtual tour. We're going to visit various historic sites, essentially in chronological order. And I'll show maps to illustrate where the sites are located and how to get from one to the next. So it's not geographical, but we are a county, a big county, but anyway, I've decided to set it up chronologically just for to make the storytelling easier. So without further ado, I want to get to my presentation. And so let's go. So let's begin our journey with a place that sounds like it belongs in a fairy tale, but instead it sits quietly along a popular bike trail. If you've ever been on the WOD trail near East Falls Church and passed by a sign that reads Brandymore Castle, you may have wondered, where's the castle? So let's take a closer look. This is number one right here, Brandymore Castle. And here it is closer up along the WOD trail, really right before you reach like the East Falls Church Metro. So here you'll see this sign, and there's clearly no castle in sight. So eventually I decided to look into it. Just off the trail, there's a short path that leads to a natural quartz outcrop. And at first glance, I mean, it just looks like a pile of rocks, right? But this formation is actually tied to a much larger and surprising complex history. It goes all the way back to 1649, when Charles II, while in exile, granted over 5 million acres of land between the Potomac and Rappahannock rivers to 7 loyal Englishmen. And it became known as the Northern Neck Land Grant. And whether or not he actually had the authority to do so is questionable, but the grant stood. Of course, this land was already home to native communities, including the Monacan, the Doeg, the Manahoac, and the Powhatan nations, all of whom were systematically displaced. Later, there was a surveyor named Charles Broadwater, originally from Surrey, England. He acquired a 151-acre parcel straddling what is now the border of Arlington and Fairfax counties. And he used that very quartz outcrop as a key landmark in his land survey, and it was referenced in 5 other Northern Neck surveys as well. As for the name Brandymore Castle, no one knows where it came from. There's no documentation explaining the reference. It simply appears in the records and has remained ever since. But even without a definitive origin, the name and the outcrop hint at a time when the landscape looked very different from the one we see today. So the next time you're on the trail and past that sign, it's worth remembering that even something as unassuming as a pile of rocks can carry centuries of stories. So now let's move a little further forward in time and south on the map to meet one of Arlington's earliest settlers whose humble log home still stands today. And this is number 2, the Ball Sellers House. The address is actually 5630 3rd Street South. It's you'll find it in the Glen Carlin neighborhood, just surrounded by other houses. Here we have the oldest house in Arlington. So little by little, settlers arrived in the area and built farms, and among them was John Ball. He was a yeoman farmer who received a 166-acre land grant from Lord Fairfax in the 4 Mile Run watershed. So this is a copy of the original 1742 deed from Lord Fairfax to John Ball. And just an aside, Lord Fairfax was born in England, but later moved to Virginia to claim his vast inheritance. He became the only British peer to reside in the American colonies, and Fairfax was friends with George Washington and was left largely alone during the American Revolution, despite his royalist leanings. But back to Ball. He built a 2-room log cabin in somewhere around 1750 in what's now the Glen Carlin neighborhood of South Arlington. And here's a picture of it. It's actually the little cabin on the right. Later on, the larger house was added on. But he lived in this 2-room log cabin with his wife and 5 daughters, all sleeping in the rustic loft, shoulder to shoulder in the same bed. As I said, this is Arlington's oldest house, and I find it remarkable because it offers a window into the everyday families who built early America. Peoples whose names don't appear in the textbooks, but whose labor and resilience shaped the world around them. And I also find it interesting because about the same time we have Mount Vernon, and that's basically what we know about that time period, basically how the rich lived. So this gives us a window into the more average household of the time. And the Arlington Historical Society offers tours of the cabin, the house. Look at the website, but generally it's in the summer on Saturday afternoons, and they have a docent there who leads you through the house and tells you about the history. Later, Ball sold the land to William Carlin, who happened to be George Washington's tailor, and he relied on enslaved labor to run the farm. And the name of the house takes its name from the first owner, John Ball, and its last, Marion Sellers. She was the last private owner who donated the house to the Historical Society in 1975. So, as I mentioned, the house later belonged to George Washington's tailor, who very well may have stopped by the house, I don't know, to pick up a coat or something. But it turns out he owned 1,000 acres of woodlands near here, number 3. This is Arlington Forest. He owned these woodlands to supply timber to Mount Vernon. So every spring, Arlington Historical Society offers a walking tour of Arlington Forest that takes you to various sites. Now, there's not tons to see with the naked eye, but the tour passes by, or at least it's obvious history to the naked eye, but the tour route passes by the Glen Carlin Library, where inside you'll see this stumpy block of something that resembles a trash can, but it's actually a historic survey marker. This is a slashed section of tree once used to define George Washington's land holdings. And it was located where Long Branch joins 4 Mile Run. In 1898, the tree fell down during a storm, and but part of its trunk has been preserved here in the library, and there's a stone marker that marks the tree's original location. And nearby, John Ball built a mill along 4 Mile Run near the intersection with Columbia Pike. There's nothing that remains today except for maybe a historic plaque, but it's these quiet landmarks that serve as subtle reminders that sometimes history is hidden in plain sight in places that we pass by every day. So now let's zoom out for a wider view, literally. As we trace history forward, we come to one of the boldest acts of nation building, which was defining the borders of the capital itself. And yes, Arlington played a central role. And this is number 4 on the map. This is actually the southernmost part of this site because there are actually several parts to this. And what I'm talking about are the oldest federal monuments in the nation. And yes, we have them right here in Arlington. In the early 1790s, George Washington began laying out the perimeters of the new capital city, which would be located just north of his home in Mount Vernon. So he, along with surveyors Benjamin Banneker and Andrew Ellicott, laid out a diamond-shaped boundary, 10 miles on each side. And at each mile, they placed stone markers, each one about 3 feet tall, 1 foot across. And if you look closely, at least the ones that remain, a lot of them have eroded down. They were made out of limestone, but some of them do remain pretty intact. Not necessarily the ones in Arlington, more in DC, but if you look closely, they're etched with details. District of Columbia on one side, showing the District of Columbia side. On the other side is Virginia or Maryland, depending on which state it was bordering, along with geographic coordinates in the date they were placed, which would have been 1791 or 1792. And in the 1920s, a Victorian-style fence was erected around each one. But here's the twist. In 1846, Arlington and the rest of what was called Alexandria County were officially retroceded or returned from the district back to Virginia. So while we were once part of DC, we've been proudly Virginian ever since. So we still have 10 of these original boundary stones here in Arlington. You'll find them in parks and along medians and even in people's backyards. And these stones make a really fun historical scavenger hunt. So let me tell you a little story. When my then boyfriend and I first started dating, he teased me for living across the river in Arlington. He lived on Capitol Hill, and I said, "Not so fast, Buster. Did you know?" I asked him that Arlington was once part of the District of Columbia. And so we became really interested and did some research and found out that most of these, there were 40 markers, and most of them are still standing. And the ones that aren't standing, there's little plaques or something that you can still see. So David and I biked to each one. And he even proposed to me at the last one, SE9, just across the river in Maryland, north of National Harbor. Just a little aside, since that one's not in Arlington. But if you're interested in seeing them yourself, just remember, for those located in people's backyards, that is private property, and you need to politely knock on the front door and let them know what you're doing. And they're totally used to it. They get like 3 or 4 people a month knocking on their doors to see the stones. You can get more information and really good maps at boundarystones.org. And this really is a wonderful way to connect with the layered history of the layered hidden history all around us. Well, really in plain sight, but not always so obvious. So here's the ones in Arlington starting at SW4. They're named based on their location within the quadrant in their chronological order along the border. So it starts at Southwest 4, 5, 6, 7, it goes up, and then you start Northwest 1, 2, 3. And just a couple of them, Southwest 6 sits on a median on South Jefferson Street, and Southwest 8 is behind the Patrick Henry Apartments near the intersection of John Marshall Drive and Wilson Boulevard. And Northwest 2 is on North 38th Street in someone's backyard. So it's really fun. So now let's step back in time again, but this time toward the river near where jets now roar into Reagan National Airport. And here you'll find the remains of an 18th century plantation with ties to George Washington's family. And this is number 5, Abingdon Plantation. Back in 1746, the Alexander family of Alexandria fame established a plantation along the Potomac. They had traded the property from the original 6,000 acre tract of 6,000 acre land grant for 6,000 hogsheads of tobacco. So picture it, George Washington hadn't quite built Mount Vernon, and there was nothing anywhere except wild lands. In 1778, John Parke Custis, he was Martha Washington's son from her first marriage, purchased the property and moved his family here. He wanted to be closer to his mother and George Washington, his stepfather. And he died, unfortunately, from camp fever during the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. And his widow, Eleanor, managed the plantation. During the Civil War, Abingdon was seized by Union forces as enemy property. Virginia was, of course, part of the South, and it was transformed into a fortified encampment and it was part of a ring of defenses encircling the capital. After the war, the property reverted to the Alexander descendants, the Hunter family, and we get a beautiful description of the plantation from Alexander Hunter Jr., as he wrote in his 1904 memoir, Johnny Reb and Billy Yank. He wrote, "We live on a splendid estate of 650 acres lying on the Potomac between Alexandria and Washington. I doubt whether in the whole Southland there had existed a finer country seat. The house was built solidly as if to defy time itself, with its beautiful trees, fine orchard, its terraced lawns, graveled walks leading to the river a quarter of a mile away, the splendid barns, the stables with fine horses for which my father, a retired naval officer, had a special fondness, the servants' quarters where dwelt the old family retainers and their offspring, some 50 or more." Here's a picture of it at the turn of the 20th century. The mansion itself burned down under suspicious circumstances in 1930. Some speculate that the railroad eyeing the property may have had something to gain. In the 1940s, DCA was built, and locals fought to preserve the plantation ruins, and they won, and the ruins are there to this day. In 1998, the ruins of Abingdon reopened as a little park. And there it is, right there between 2 parking garages at the airport. There's benches and historical plaques and a reconstructed outline of the original house. And the juxtaposition never fails to amaze me. These jets taking off nearby, near the quiet remains of an 18th century plantation. Just a reminder of how many layers of history lie beneath our everyday paths. So here's a little more detail on how to find it, because it's hidden in plain sight. But you can access it from the Mount Vernon Trail, which is along here, though there's really no sign that tells you where to go. And you go through a tunnel, and then you go around this parking lot where guys are washing rental cars. They're very nice and friendly. And from there, on the far side, there's a path that goes up to the park. So an easier way to get there is from the airport, and there are signs that show the way through the parking garage, the northern parking garage. I think there are signs that show you a way through the garage and then on a pathway to the park. And there are also exhibits within the airport that talk about the plantation's history. And there's one little aside that I find fascinating about all of this, and that's that John Parke Custis, he was the father who died at the Battle of Yorktown. He had served on George Washington's staff during the siege of Boston in 1775, 1776. And he had become an emissary to British forces while there. So accounts report that he became friends with a young British officer who gave him a little sprig of a weeping willow that the officer said he had taken from a famous tree in England at Twickenham that had been planted by Alexander Pope. And the officer had intended to plant his willow sprig on the land that he would seize from the Americans. And so following his army's defeat, he decided to give the sprig to Custis, who planted it at Abingdon. And the resulting tree reportedly became the progenitor of all weeping willows growing in the United States. So I don't know if that's true or not, but it's an interesting story. And if you go along the Mount Vernon Trail here, there's lots of weeping willows, just really beautiful. So the story of Abingdon connects directly to our next two sites because when Civil War came, this land became a battleground, though luckily there were no battles per se, but there were definitely fortifications and shifting allegiances. So here we are looking at two forts. Here's 6 and 7. Fort C.F. Smith and Fort Ethan Allen. So these forts, they date from the 1860s when the Civil War broke out in Arlington, sitting right across the river from Washington, D.C., suddenly became the front line of defense for the capital city. So Virginia, as a southern state, seceded from the Union on May 23rd, 1861, and the first Union troops crossed the Potomac River during the early morning hours the next day, May 24th, 1861, to occupy Arlington Heights and Alexandria. At 2 a.m., roughly 140,000 Union troops began crossing the river, and James Parke, who was an enslaved man living at Arlington House, observed the scene and noted that the Union soldiers advanced like, quote, bees a-coming in the moonlight. There was little opposition. And the only opposition that came was from a few Confederate pickets at the southern end of Long Bridge and in Alexandria Harbor. So they immediately began building a network of earthworks in Arlington, Alexandria, as well as Washington, D.C., to protect the capital from Confederate attacks. And in just 7 weeks, the earliest fortifications were put up. Forts were put up right and left, and trenches were cut through pastures and gardens. Forests were cut down. Troop encampments were everywhere. Possession of property in Arlington was taken with little or no regard to the owners or occupants. Of all of these, Arlington has the remains of two notable Civil War forts that can be visited. As I mentioned, Fort C.F. Smith and Fort Ethan Allen. So the first one, Fort C.F. Smith, was built in 1863 on a bluff overlooking the Potomac River in Spout Run. And it was built on the property of Thomas Jewell, who lived with his family here until, quote, the soldiers robbed my house and ordered me off. And because of its elevation and location, it could protect the Aqueduct Bridge, which was near where the Key Bridge is right now, from invaders traveling between Georgetown and Roslyn. And today there is a park featuring the ruins of the fort's original structures, including a bomb-proof, a well, a magazine, gun emplacements. There's a half-mile trail that wanders through the 19-acre site with interpretive signage. There's also a visitor center that highlights the history of the fort and immerses visitors into the lives of Union soldiers who garrisoned the forts in Arlington. There's a really fun interactive soldier database, which compiles and shares the stories of real soldiers who were stationed there. And the second fort is Fort Ethan Allen. It was built September 1861, shortly after the Army's defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run in late July that year. And it was built on the highlands near the Potomac River. Here it is right here. It was built to command all approaches to Chain Bridge south of Pimmit Run. And there's a park there now located on Stafford Street. So the first fort would have been down here. So this one is a little bit north. Here's a picture of the fort back in the day. And you can still see several major above ground features, including extensive earthworks. There's a bomb-proof, gun platforms, traces of magazines. There's also an outlier trench that was designated as a local historic district by the Arlington County Board. I also read that while the fort never saw any battle during the Civil War, but there was a little skirmish here in 2004 over the construction of a dog park. So in the end, the Arlington line was never attacked, not even after the federal defeat at the Second Battle of Bull Run, proving it to be an effective strategic defense system. So speaking of Civil War, no site better embodies its complicated legacy than a home just up the hill from the forts, and that is Arlington House, number 8 here. So when the Union soldiers invaded Arlington, one of their objections, of course, was Arlington House. It was the home of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, which is actually, this whole story is related to Abingdon Plantation. After John Parke Custis died in 1781, the one who died of camp fever at the Battle of Yorktown, his son, George Washington Parke Custis, was raised by Martha and George Washington, and they called him Wash, and he adored George Washington. And starting in 1802, he oversaw construction of Arlington House as both a home, but also a memorial to his step-grandfather. And the house was built by enslaved labor and completed in 1818, and he filled it with all kinds of Washington memorabilia and artifacts. In 1831, Wash's only surviving daughter, Mary Anna Randolph Custis, married Lieutenant Robert E. Lee at Arlington House the same year she inherited the property. So Robert E. Lee was living here at the onset of the Civil War. And when he resigned from the U.S. Army on April 21st, 1861, choosing to fight for the Confederacy, he walked out of the house 2 days later, never to return. And Mrs. Lee also left in a hurry, leaving the responsibility of packing up their valuables, including all of the George Washington memorabilia, as well as the key to the mansion, to Selina Gray, who was her enslaved personal maid and housekeeper. And the property was seized and eventually became part of Arlington National Cemetery, where some of the war's Union dead occupied the first burial sites. In fact, Union soldiers were buried in Mrs. Lee's rose garden to ensure that the Lees wouldn't come back. For years, after it became a historic site overseen by the National Park Service in 1933, Arlington House basically served the memory of Robert E. Lee. But after a recent extensive renovation, it now tells a fuller story. That is, the National Park Service has incorporated new research on the African Americans who built, lived, and worked there. The former enslaved quarters now house exhibits and films. Extensive research has been done to learn about the enslaved individuals who lived there, to name them, give them names. And new exhibits and tours emphasize the stories of individuals like Selina Gray, Mrs. Custis's personal maid and head housekeeper. She, her husband, and their 8 children lived in one room, and that had a small loft where some of the children slept. And the loft was accessible by a ladder. And the crawl space in the attic was accessible, or it was only high enough for children. It was only high enough for small children. There were no windows in the attic. There was also Aunt Judy. She was an elderly woman who lived in one of the rooms. She was born at Mount Vernon and was considered a dower slave, meaning she belonged to Martha Washington's first husband's estate. And while George Washington freed his slaves in his will, he could not illegally free dower slaves. So George Washington Parke Custis inherited Judy and brought her to Arlington House. And here she may have worked as Mary Lee's nurse. When she died in 1855, she was 76 years old. So also here, there's a small outlying museum that focuses on Lee himself. And he remains central to Arlington House's history, but recent efforts aim to present a more nuanced portrayal of his life, including his role in the Confederacy and his complex relationship with slavery. Exhibits now explore his decision to fight for the Confederacy and the impact of his actions for the nation and the enslaved people at Arlington. And interpretive panels ask powerful questions, such as, do you think the government has an obligation to protect enemy property? In what ways do you struggle for freedom? How do we reconcile Lee's many roles as soldier, father, slaveholder, educator? So it's no longer a shrine about just one man. It's a site of reckoning. It makes us think. It's a place that challenges us to confront the legacies of power and privilege. So while the story of Lee has long dominated this hillside, there's another lesser known chapter that unfolded just outside his former gates. And this is a story of freedom, resilience, and a community born in the shadow of war. And this is number 9, Freedmen's Village. As we just talked about, Arlington House was forever changed by the Civil War. Just beyond its gates lies another story altogether of the formerly enslaved people who found freedom and community in Freedmen's Village. Freedmen's Village was founded after the Emancipation Proclamation. It was home to freed African Americans who built a thriving, self-sustaining community. Sojourner Truth helped care for the village's children and encouraged mothers to send their kids to school. Frederick Douglass, who lived across the river in Anacostia, came to visit as well. And for a time, things were hopeful. But as Reconstruction brought backlash, as African Americans started to gain property, education, political power, at that time, Arlington's Black population made up 75 to 80% of the community, and white residents pushed back. Freedmen's Village was closed in 1900, and its residents scattered to various neighborhoods around Arlington and farther afield. And not much remains of Freedmen's Village today, other than a historical plaque in Foxcroft Heights Park, overlooking the cemetery that marks the site at the former community. There's some historical signs there. And additionally, Section 27 of Arlington National Cemetery is where there are many of the graves of many Freedmen's Village residents. So many of these displaced residents helped form new Black communities around Arlington and beyond, including Halls Hill, near where I live in North Arlington. And that is our next stop. It's located, here it is, number 10. It's near the Waycroft Woodlawn neighborhood. And this was the oldest enclave in Northern Virginia, settled by newly freed slaves shortly after the Civil War. And the community's origin included 2 distinct names, Halls Hill and Highview Park. The area was originally a portion of the estates of William Marcy and Basil Hall, who sold most of his land to his freed slaves after the war for about 60 cents an acre. And then in the 1930s, white development was being put up nearby, and a literal segregation wall went up to divide the communities between the Black and the white. It still stands in part today. There's a historical marker near the intersection of North Culpeper Street and 17th Street North that explains the story. Halls Hill became its own self-sufficient community because it had to, just as other Black neighborhoods around town did. Black residents weren't allowed to use the white schools, the hospitals. They weren't allowed to use Virginia Hospital Center, police, fire services. They weren't welcome at the barbershop, Glebe Theater, nor Evans Coffee Shop, which was from what I read, a snooty place decorated with animal heads and historical memorabilia and frequented by the DAR and Daughters of Confederacy families. They didn't have a city water or electricity source. Water came from wells. Bathrooms were outhouses. Roads were dark at night and weren't paved until after World War II. And there were no sidewalks, no drainage. The police never came unless they were looking for someone, and the fire department wouldn't come at all. So in fact, the firehouse on Langston Boulevard, the one across the street from Heidelberg, this is the first African-American run volunteer firehouse south of the Mason-Dixon line, and it's recently been beautifully restored. Halls Hill had its own elementary school, the Langston Elementary School, which was convenient, but it only had four rooms until at least 1953. The closest high school was 5 miles away for Black teens. It was Hoffman, Boston, 5-mile walk with no school bus or public transportation. So there's a little park on Langston Boulevard that has memory bricks customized by neighborhood residents. Though the neighborhood is changing as elsewhere, there are still people who live there whose roots go back to the beginning. And here you'll also find a statue. It's called The Family. It's a steel sculpture of a man, woman, and child holding hands, and it symbolizes unity among families and residents of the neighborhood. So Halls Hill wasn't the only Black community to take root in Arlington. As I mentioned, there were others, but some were not allowed to last. So as we head south on the map toward Crystal City to number 11, we uncover the echoes of a neighborhood erased. So when I was doing my research, just when I thought I couldn't be surprised anymore, I stumbled on a story hidden in plain sight in a brand new park in Crystal City called Met Park. It's part of Amazon's new development there. And it's a lovely park with trails and indigenous plants and some art installations. But in the center, there's this brick tower. And when I first saw it, I wasn't sure what it was, whether it was old or new or what. And I wandered inside and discovered 903 ceramic vessels hanging from the ceiling. And each one is beautiful and unique in natural colors of blue and gray and brown. There's a subtle changing light from above that illuminates them. So this is an art installation by local artist Nikisha Durrett, and it commemorates the 903 African Americans who were forced out of their homes in a neighborhood called Queen City, as well as nearby East Arlington when the Pentagon was built in 1942. So we always hear about how quickly the Pentagon was built during the time of war, and isn't that amazing? But we never hear about those who it affected, who lost their homes and were displaced. And I spoke with a man, Mr. William Volan, who's now in his 90s, and he still lives in Arlington. He remembers being forced out of Queen City as a child. He and his family ended up at a trailer park in Arlington, though many of his friends were scattered and he never heard from them again. There were no phones, no way to stay connected. And to him, I mean, he remembers that to this day. And he says the trailer park was muddy and unsanitary with shared bathrooms. It was a devastating upheaval, one we rarely hear about. But now, thanks to this public artwork, Queen City's story is no longer silent. So loss and renewal continue to shape Arlington, and as one community was displaced, another took root. For example, after the fall of Saigon, Arlington became a beacon for Vietnamese refugees who built a vibrant cultural hub right in Clarendon, and that's number 12. Vietnamese groceries and shops and restaurants filled the area with annual festivals and flea markets buzzing with activity. Little Saigon also became a place where the Vietnamese could receive news of Vietnam and of friends and family. Many people had left Vietnam suddenly and without communicating their travel plans to friends and family. Several stories had bulletin boards where they could leave notes and messages, hopeful that they could learn the whereabouts of those they had lost touch with. Shopping services allowed people to send packages home to Vietnam, which was difficult to do elsewhere. And Little Saigon also served as a social setting for interacting with other members of the community with entertainment like live Vietnamese music, performed in cafes. And even when I first moved here in the early 90s, I remember some of the restaurants that were still here, Queen Bee and Cafe Saigon, for example. Sadly, the Vietnamese family businesses eventually declined as sparkling high-rises and residential buildings and modern chain shops took their places. And many of them moved to Eden Center, just over the county line in Falls Church. But there's one restaurant that remains, and that's Nam Viet, AKA Pho 79. It opened in 1986, and it's still run by the Nguyen family. And when you find it, you're in for a treat. And yes, they serve pho and bun, and which all are amazing. But on their menu, which is really extensive, you also find hard to find Vietnamese dishes like crispy glazed baby back ribs, caramelized catfish in a clay pot, wild salmon with jalapenos, ginger, and onions. In the back, there's an unassuming tiki bar that creates frilly umbrella drinks. And and there's also history here. Be sure to check out the wall of photographs, which includes former American POWs, politicos, presidents who have all dined here. And you can learn more about the Vietnamese history along a 5-stop walking tour through Clarendon that yields a quick history of Little Saigon. So look for 5 stickers with QR codes on former Vietnamese businesses that showcase archival photos and oral histories. And you can get more information by going to littlesaigonclarendon.com. So Clarendon was just the beginning. We go south a little bit to Columbia Pike, number 13. And this is a corridor that became a tapestry of global migration, stitched together by families and food and stories from every continent. A little bit of history. Columbia Pike is one of the oldest thoroughfares in Arlington. It's connected the nation's capital to Northern Virginia since 1810. During the Civil War, it was the most direct route into Confederate territory. And there were 2 forts along it, Fort Runyon and Fort Albany, though neither of which remain today. That said, just last week, I was driving around in the area and I saw a historical plaque describing Fort Albany. In 1892, the Pike became a commuter corridor when the first electric railway in Northern Virginia was built. During World War II, temporary housing trailers were constructed along the Pike to house displaced African Americans when the Pentagon was built. The military also built a planned community of single-family homes called Columbia Forest along Columbia Pike to house the influx of federal workers. But the reason I want to bring it up most is because of the large number of immigrants who have moved here, giving it the name World in a Zip Code. The World in a Zip Code. Residents here speak more than 100 languages. Refugees from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia flocked here with the end of the war in Southeast Asia. Latinos started arriving in the 1980s, followed in the 90s by refugees and immigrants from East Asia and the Middle East. And today, the communities of the Pike include people from Somalia, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Sudan, Mongolia, El Salvador, Bolivia, Ukraine, Egypt, and the list just goes on and on. And one way you can experience this is through the food. Many have opened small restaurants, little mom and pop shops with some of the best food around, making it the ultimate international foodie destination. And some of the favorites include City Kebab and Curry House, El Pike Bolivian Resto Bar, Boru Ramen, Japanese, Rincon Thai Cuisine, Celtic House Irish Pub and Restaurant, and Dama Pastry and Restaurant, which has really good Ethiopian food. And the story I love about all this is how united the different cultural groups are. Instead of establishing like a Japantown here and a French town there, they all are here along the Pike, mixed in together. And that became evident during the pandemic, when these small restaurants worked together to support each other. And most of them survived the pandemic. They organized so that people could buy meals for hospital workers. There was a buy a nurse lunch program, for example. There were other creative ways to help each other out. An Arlington artist, Sushmita Muzadar, she gathered stories from the 22204 zip code. That's the world in a zip code, 22204. And she compiled all these stories in a book that celebrates this diversity. And there was also, there is a moving exhibit of photographs that document this diversity. And it's also been, the exhibit was put in this book as well. So now let's connect these communities through movement. And Arlington's story has always been about passage, paths taken, borders crossed. And one of the most significant passages is the W&OD Trail. The W&OD, Washington and Old Dominion, runs 45 miles from Shirlington to Purcellville, with 5 miles of it in Arlington. And it takes its name from the trains that ran along the right-of-way from 1859 to 1968. And the entrepreneurs who built it dreamed of bringing coal and other riches from the Appalachians to the port of Alexandria. I guess the B&O Railroad was going on at the same time and was taking a lot of the competition. So they decided they needed to build their own. It never happened. Less than a decade after it was built, the railroad was almost destroyed during the Civil War, and it was slowly rebuilt. Its heyday came in the 20th century when it provided service 3 times daily from Alexandria to Falls Church, Leesburg, and Purcellville. It was also part of a network that delivered milk to Washingtonians from Loudoun County. They would send it on one railway to the Bluemont station, change trains, and send it on its way to Washington. The train also became a leisure route for people escaping to the countryside, out in Loudoun County to avoid the city's heat. So in 1916, there were 65 stations on the WOD, but eventually the railroad began to decline with neglect and poor management. There was talk in the 1960s for a high-speed commuter rail to Loudoun County, though that never happened. At that point, there were few commuters on the 2-lane Route 7 east of Leesburg, so there really wasn't a need. When the WOD ceased operations in 1968, the Virginia Electric and Power Company bought the right-of-way for its electric power transmission lines. And eventually, in 1977, the Northern Virginia Regional Park Authority purchased the right-of-way to use it as a paved recreational trail. And we have it we've had it for our enjoyment ever since. So some history is really tough. And just a short distance from the trail, we arrive at the Pentagon in a memorial to lives lost on a day none of us will forget. And so we're going to talk about the National 9/11 Pentagon Memorial. This on September 11th, 2001, after two jets struck the Twin Towers in New York City, American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon's west side, killing 184 people, 64 passengers, crew, and hijackers aboard the hijacked jet, and 125 Pentagon workers on the ground. And you may remember that day if you were here. I do. The sky was so blue. It was such a beautiful day. And I was on my way to work at National Geographic. And when I got there, the second plane had struck the second tower. And we realized it wasn't just a random act, which is what we thought at first, but there was talk of burning cars on the National Mall, and maybe another plane headed towards the Capitol or the White House. So I went home. I took the subway, which probably wasn't the smartest thing, but for some reason I thought that was the safest place to be. By the time I got home, I had heard about the Pentagon being hit, and I actually went to the Virginia Hospital Center to give blood, thinking they would bring victims there. I remember the doctors standing outside waiting because they were just sort of milling around because nobody was coming, and anybody who had been struck had been killed. So among the plane's passengers was a group of inner city students and 3 DC public school teachers who were en route to California to visit the Channel Islands National Park as part of a special National Geographic field trip. And I didn't know the leaders personally, but I'd seen them in the elevator. I mean, they were beloved at National Geographic. And to this day on 9/11, their photos and flowers are placed near the cafeteria to remember them. So they and the others who perished that day are remembered at the National 9/11 Pentagon Memorial outside the Pentagon where the plane hit. And each victim is honored with an illuminated bench inscribed with his or her name, age, and location at the time of the attack. The memorial is open 24/7, and there's a 24-minute audio tour that leads you to points of interest. It's available by calling this number, 202-741-1004. And needless to say, it's a somber space and one that's important for educating future generations. So now I just want to visit some smaller sites, tiny little pockets of the past that are sprinkled all around our county. I mean, history is everywhere you look. So among the pockets of the past are the historic cemeteries you find here. In Arlington National Cemetery, of course, is the big one. But Arlington has smaller cemeteries that contain loads of history. And among them is the Ball Carlin Cemetery, here number 1 in the Glen Carlin neighborhood. This one dates from 1785. Members of 2 of Arlington's earliest families, the Ball and Carlin families, were buried at this site between 1766 and 1908. And it's located in the neighborhood where John Ball became one of the first settlers after receiving a 166-acre land grant from Lord Fairfax in 1742. So it's near the John Ball house. There's also the Old Ball family burial grounds, number 2 here, just a little bit on the other side of Ballston. And this cemetery caught me by surprise. It's along my run that I do every so often down Washington Boulevard toward Clarendon. And I've seen the Virginia historical marker sign a million times. It's right there along the sidewalk. But I had no idea that if you go up the driveway past an automotive shop, you'll find this old burial ground. And John Ball was granted the property in 1796, and his wife was the first burial in 1804. And most of the gravestones have disappeared, and in their place, there are modern stones. They're modern stones that preserves the names of the people who were buried there. But the fact that this sacred space is there in the middle of buildings and cars and everything is amazing to me. And you've got to think this property, this land cost a fortune. There's also the Robert Ball Sr. family burial ground, number 3. And this one is adjacent to the Central United Methodist Church right across the street from Ballston Metro Stop. And it has burials spanning from 1766 to 1908 the final resting place for members of the Ball family, including ensign John Ball, who was a Revolutionary War veteran, and his descendants. In 1906, the Ball family conveyed the burial ground to the Methodist Episcopal Church South for construction of a church. And the church was recently rebuilt, and there was some controversy about relocating the graves, but in the end, the graveyard was preserved as a fenced-in grassy area next to the church. There's also Callaway Cemetery, number 4, up here on Langston Boulevard. This is the oldest known church-affiliated African-American graveyard in the Halls Hill neighborhood. It was founded in 1866 by freed slaves who bought the land from the owners of Basil Hall's plantation. It represents the important connection to Arlington's undocumented African-American heritage. Unfortunately, there are no church records pertaining to the Callaway Cemetery or its burials, but we do know the first known interment took place here in 1891, and the last interment was in 1959. And it's estimated that 100 people are buried in the 7,100 square foot lawn, with more than half lost in unmarked graves. So historic African-American cemeteries often had little or no formal landscaping, and at times ornamental plants or vegetation were used to mark the grave locations. And the graves tended to be randomly placed and scattered instead of placed in a symmetrical arrangement. And wooden coffins were typical, often marked by simple wood or stone monuments that were made by hand, as were unmarked graves or those marked only by fieldstones placed on end. So this cemetery is maintained by the adjacent Callaway United Methodist Church. And notable people who we do know are buried here include Winstead Callaway, 1843 to 1891. He was a Methodist minister in the namesake of the Callaway United Methodist Church and Cemetery. And here too is Margaret Hyson. Her dates are 1825 to 1891. And she's one of the early leaders of Callaway Methodist Church, and she was enslaved on the Halls Hill plantation before emancipation. And one more interesting cemetery is the Mount Olivet Cemetery on Glebe Road. It's number 5. And this one has an interesting story behind it. Mount Olivet United Methodist Church has roots that go all the way back to a good old-fashioned land dispute. Back in the 1850s, 2 couples, John and Cornelia Brown and William and Ann Marcy, were caught in a bit of a tug-of-war, and they couldn't agree on who owned the land where the church now stands. So rather than duking it out in a rather neighborly twist, they each deeded the property in trust for the same purpose, to serve as a home for a Methodist Protestant church and burial ground. And that's how the idea for Mount Olivet began to take shape. And the cemetery here is one of the oldest cemeteries in Arlington. It's nestled right next to the sanctuary, and it holds the stories of generations of Arlingtonians, from Civil War veterans to everyday folks who shaped the local community. And one of the people buried here is Sue Landon Vaughn. She's one of the founders of Decoration Day, aka Memorial Day. In Mississippi, during April 1865, she began the practice of decorating the graves of Civil War dead, both Confederate and Union. So moving on to something a little lighter, history doesn't always have to be in headstones. Sometimes it lingers in the hum of a neighborhood store where generations gathered. So here we have Ayers Hardware on Washington Boulevard in the Westover neighborhood. It was founded by John W. Ayers in 1948 as a 5 and dime. It was called the J.W. Ayers 5 and 10 cent store. He was a World War II veteran from Georgia. He was stationed in Hawaii and saw action in Okinawa. He had moved to the Washington area in 1924 to manage a Woolworths. And he became deeply involved in the Westover community, and in fact became known as the mayor of Westover. And he lobbied for sidewalks and streetlights, oversaw the Westover Christmas tree, Halloween dances, Westover Days, which was a street dance that took place on Washington Boulevard in July. He was also known for handing out candy to kids before the holidays, and he operated the store until his death in 1976 when the Kaplan family purchased the business, ensuring that its continued presence in the community. So today the store is a local institution. Its original counters and shelving are still in use. And you can find everything under the sun here. And so not all history announces itself loudly. Sometimes you have to read historical markers and just imagine. And in this case, one of the nation's greatest political scandals. Yes, we're talking about the Deep Throat parking garage. There's a marker at the parking garage at 1401 Wilson Boulevard down in Roslyn, and it tells it all. How back in the 70s, informant named Deep Throat shared important information to Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, allowing them to expose the Watergate scandal and the involvement of the Nixon administration. And both Woodward and Bernstein promised not to reveal the informant's identity until he died or consented to having his role made public. And so in May 2005, W. Mark Felt revealed himself as Deep Throat in a Vanity Fair article. He was a high-level official in the government. And there's talk, this is the garage right here, the exterior, there's talk that it's being demolished, but the historical sign still stands. But here's the parking space, I guess, where it all happened, D32. So Arlington has an extensive public art program, which definitely ties into history. And there's one I want to highlight, and that is Dark Star Park here, also in Roslyn. Every year on August 1st at precisely 9:32 a.m., a crowd gathers at a traffic island around two concrete balls and metal poles. And then I realized when I was working on this on Friday, it was August 1st. The day was cloudy, so I'm not sure exactly what transpired. But on sunny days, at exactly the right moment, the crowd gasps and claps as the light aligns just right so that the shadows of the spheres and poles, there's these spheres and these poles, match with permanent shadow images in the ground, like this. And this spectacle is the 1984 work of artist Nancy Holt. She was part of the Earth, Land, and Conceptual Art movement and devoted to finding new places where art could be found. And I would say she found that here. And Dark Star Park is located within a little 0.4-acre space. It comprises 5 large concrete balls in total, some positioned along the curb in addition to the ones in the traffic island. There's also 2 pools, 4 steel poles, and 2 tunnels. And I mean, it's truly something to partake in the gathering on its special day, but even when the shadows don't align, this otherworldly space invites reflection. Oh, and why August 1st? That's the day in 1860 when William Henry Ross acquired the land that would become Roslyn. So as we wrap up, there's a few places to go I want to share to learn more about Arlington's history. And the first one is the Charlie Clark Center for Local History at Arlington Central Library. This is an amazing resource that has all kinds of historical documents that are available to anyone who wants to learn about the history of Arlington County. Charlie Clark was known as our man in Washington. He wrote interesting stories about Arlington for the local newspaper, the Falls Church News Press. He also published several books, including Arlington County Chronicles, History Hidden of Arlington, and Lost Arlington County, full of all kinds of fascinating things, all things Arlington, including plenty of history. He passed away in 2023 but there's a new man in Arlington, Bill Fogarty, who's busy writing more about Arlington. And I understand that he will be leading a class in the near future for Encore Learning on Arlington in the 20s and 30s. So definitely something to keep an eye out for. We also have the Arlington Historical Museum. This is the Arlington Historical Society's museum, and it recently reopened after a 2-year renovation. It's located on Arlington Ridge Road, and it's located in the old Hume Schools, the oldest existing schoolhouse in the county, which dates back to 1891. And the museum is a repository of Arlington's history, similar to a family attic filled with memories. It covers wide range of historical periods, Native Americans to the colonial era, the Civil War, industrialization, World War II, and more recent events like the Pentagon and the 9/11 attacks. And one of the museum's highlights is a preserved schoolroom that replicates its appearance at the beginning of the 20th century. And there's even a functional school bell that you can ring. And the museum hosts lectures and events, both in person and online, and they provide all kinds of opportunities to learn about local history. And then there's also the Black Heritage Museum of Arlington on Columbia Pike. It was founded by Dr. Scott Taylor, and that's where I actually learned a lot about what I just shared. It's a small but mighty museum. So much history there, from early days of enslavement at Abingdon Plantation to the civil rights struggles of the 20th century and beyond. Did you know that we had sit-ins at lunch encounters right here in Arlington? On June 9th, 1990, about a dozen people walked into People's Drugstore on Lee Highway in Cherrydale and began what would become a peaceful countywide demonstration for the right of all people to be served at what had been historically white-only lunch counters. So again, all kinds of interesting history there. So in all my traipsing around the county, I found myself reintroduced to Arlington, not just the Arlington I thought I knew, but one shaped by all who have lived here. The enslaved, the free, the newcomers, the natives, those who were honored and those who were erased. And what I discovered is that Arlington isn't just preserving the past, it's confronting it. We're lifting the veil on hard histories, honoring forgotten communities, and asking the right essential questions about who we are and who we want to be. And to me, that's what history should do, not only live in textbooks and museums, but walk with us, challenge us, help us see things more clearly. And we're always adding to the story. In fact, I recently learned about stumbling stones being placed in front of the former home of enslaved African Americans. This echoes the tradition in Europe, where such markers honor Jewish families and others taken from their homes during the Holocaust. And the first 3 were placed at the Ball Sellers house, but there have been others placed elsewhere as well. And I believe it's an ongoing process. They'll be adding more in the future. So this is a quiet but powerful act of remembrance, and it's something I'll be sure to include in the next edition of my book, because they weren't going on when I was writing it. Because that's the thing, Arlington keeps evolving, and so must the way we tell its story. The more we understand where we've been, the better we can imagine where we're going. So thank you for taking this journey with me today, from boundary stones to buried neighborhoods, from log cabins to plantation ruins. Every corner of this county holds a story, often overlooked, sometimes uncomfortable, but always worth telling. And in a place as layered as Arlington, that understanding is key to shaping a future that includes us all. So that's what I have for you today. Let's open the floor to some Q&A, and I'd love to hear some of your stories about Arlington.
Barbara, that was just great. I really can't thank you enough. I was taking notes the whole time. I did want to remind everybody that this was recorded, so if you'd like to see it again, if you missed missed some things that you wanted to take notes on, will be available tomorrow on our YouTube channel. Also, I wanted to mention the stumbling stones. Is that we will be having a presentation on that in another month or so. So everybody keep your eye out for that. So that's exciting. But it was just such a rich presentation. I mean, I kind of can't say anything more than that. It was just great. So let's get to those questions and answers and comments. How about that? And by the way, all these hearts and claps were floating up on the screen. You might have missed them. So that shows everybody's appreciation. Can Laura, can I have the Q&A here? I'm just trying to pull it up. Okay. Kate asked the question, can you please restate the street and intersection where the Halls Hill wall and plaque are located?
I think it's North Culpeper and 17th Street. I think it's around there. I go by it all the time, but
Okay.
we can look.
Pat is the question. Arlington also has a racy and dangerous history in the area of Roslyn called Dead Man's Hollow, gambling, brothels, murders, places so dangerous that farmers needed armed guards to protect them. That would be a very interesting webinar as well. Are you familiar with that, Barbara?
Somebody else at a different presentation I did brought that up. I don't know, the mob, all kinds of stuff, nefarious stuff going on in Roslyn that piqued my interest, but I need to learn about it more too.
Okay.
I mean, that's the thing. It just goes on and on, just the history that we have here.
The county recently, another question, county recently dedicated a plaque, one of the metal types for Queen City. It will be placed near the area where Queen City stood.
Okay.
There's some information.
That's good to know.
Okay. Steve says, great presentations. Can we recommend a complete guide to Arlington that includes the sites you covered? Also interested in the same for the city of Alexandria.
I mean, again, I would look at our man in Arlington's books that he wrote. I mean, I listed the books that he wrote, very extensive.
Where can people buy those books? At the Historical Society, I believe, right?
Well, I know I've seen them at Ayers Drugstore too, at Ayers Hardware.
Okay. Okay. But I'm pretty sure it's at the
I'm sure they're at the historical.
Yeah. And how about your book? Where can people buy your book?
You can buy it through Reedy Press. They have a website, or Amazon.
Okay.
And well, it's also in Borders, Barnes and Noble, various shops around town have it.
I saw it at Trade Routes in Westover.
Yeah, Trade Routes has it.
Yep.
Okay. Can you talk about the GWP Custis Synfax connection? Synfax, SYPH.
Yeah. I know that the Black Heritage Museum of Arlington goes into deep detail about that. I don't know. I mean, I can't talk about it off the top of my head. I mean, I'm not necessarily a historian, but yeah, in fact, one of the Syfax descendants, I mean, they're still around and attended one of my presentations, as I recall. So, I mean, that's a very poignant part of our history for sure.
Okay. Joanne makes a comment. Thanks for this presentation and your eloquent conclusion. And I think everybody agrees with that. Your conclusion was just great to kind of center us about everything, about the importance of this and the meaningfulness of all of this. So thank you for that. Jean asked the question, what surprised you most as you wrote this? And can you suggest a history and food-focused itinerary for 36 hours in Arlington?
I mean, I would have to say Queen City is what surprised me the most. I mean, I mean, this is why you have to go out and visit places, because I figured I needed to go visit Metropolitan Park. I mean, I knew it was part of Amazon, but it's like, well, it's this new park that people are talking about. I had no idea that that art installation was there. I mean, it took me totally by surprise. Didn't know anything about the history of people being displaced from their homes. I mean, that just like blew me away. And I ended up researching it more extensively, and I wrote a story for BBC Travel on it. And anyway, I think that's what surprised me the most.
Okay. Can you scroll down, Laura? Any interest in the historical marker about the duel between Randolph and Clay?
I love that marker. I almost included it in this presentation. Yeah, I just think it's so interesting. It's right there on Glebe going toward Chain Bridge. And yeah, I'm very interested in it. I need to do more research on it. I know that I guess duels took place here because they couldn't take place in DC at the time. So I don't know. That's just another aspect of our history that really interesting.
Okay, thank you. Carol says Jackson City next to the 14th Street Bridge has so much history. Jackson City?
See, I need to look that up too.
Well, we look forward to your next presentation. And
I'm writing it down right here.
Yeah. Thank you, Barbara. As Steve says, is there a book that provides a complete history of the trolley lines that ran along 4 Mile Run and the W&OD Trail?
I'll tell you where I got a lot of my history was they have historical plaques right there at the Bluemont Junction along, I think it's between mile 3 and 4. They have a bunch of historical plaques there that talk about the history, but I don't know about a complete book about it. I imagine it would be interwoven in, other history books. Again, our man in Arlington.
Okay. Claire mentions, by the way, that she bought your book at One More Page bookstore.
Oh yeah, I think they have it too. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Thank you for buying it.
You're welcome. Well, good. I got it. Sandy says, why doesn't Arlington have an old city center like Old Town and Georgetown? Lack of a good harbor, is that the reason?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of it, I mean, we have like all these different little neighborhoods, right? I think it's following the Black history where we have these different centers within the county that grew up sort of separately. So there was never one central place. And yeah, I guess there wasn't a reason to cluster because we didn't have a harbor. It started with Arlington House, and then it just sort of, I mean, I think it's following the African American history.
Okay. Nancy says that regarding Craig Syphax, Craig Syphax has a walking tour of this area, Penrose and Arlington Heights, where he grew up, and he details a lot about the family history. I noticed that these walks are usually given via neighborhood Facebook page.
Okay, well, that's interesting.
Kate also mentions there's a book called Washington and Old Dominion Railroad by Ames W. Williams.
Okay, writing that down too.
There's a lot of people that know a lot of things, that care a lot about Arlington and Alexandria too. Any more questions? Any other thoughts? Any thoughts to share with Barbara besides all the applause and hearts that went up? Barbara, how did you get into travel writing?
Oh, I've just always been interested in travel. I've always been interested in writing. My dream was to work for National Geographic, and when I was in graduate school, I was actually set to go to Bulgaria to work on an English language newspaper. but I always had this idea of travel in the back of my mind. And I applied for an internship at National Geographic Traveler just on a whim. That was back in the day where you wrote letters. So I wrote a letter to the editor and they accepted. And that's basically how I got started.
It's a pretty nice place to start, National Geographic.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, like I
Yeah.
said, it was my
Yeah.
dream. So
That's great. So everybody, I do remind you to fill out the survey to tell Barbara how much you enjoyed her presentation and share any additional thoughts with her. Barbara, again, I can't thank you enough. Clearly, everybody was engaged in what you were saying. Everybody's hungry for more information, and you provided it. So thank you. Appreciate it, in particular the historical emphasis. There's a lot more in Barbara's book about restaurants to try, and I didn't know there was a crab shack here in Arlington, and now I do. So to check out the rest of her book as well. So and thank you very much, and thank you everybody for coming. Look for the survey and look for our special events that are coming up this fall, both the Monday presentations, but also our in-person tours. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.